Welcome back into the CBMW podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Swan, joined, as always, alongside by Colin Smothers, the executive director of CBMW and the president of CBMW, Denny Burke. Today, we want to talk about an article that was recently released, made some rounds on the interwebs. It's from the Oxford Journal of Sexual Medicine. Researchers from Baylor College of Medicine, the University of Texas Medical Branch, and the University of Texas Health, Houston. Guys, can you get us started talking about this article, what it says, and why it's important for us to bring up in our podcast today?
Well, it's kind of right in the wheelhouse of our concerns, because it's a study of so-called transgender people who have undergone sex change surgeries. And I say so-called transgender, and I say so-called sex change surgeries because we wouldn't recognize a transgender identity as a validated identity, and we would not recognize sex change surgery as actually changing anyone's sex. It's actually a misnomer because you can't change somebody's sex. But there was a study done by these researchers out of Texas and published in this Oxford Journal studying what the effects are on people who have gone through these surgeries. What are the outcomes? What does life look like for them after having gone through the surgeries? And it's really interesting because the background to the study, I'm just going to read to you a little bit from the abstract of the study. But the background of the study is that transgender individuals face heightened psychological distress, including depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. And then it says here, partly due to stigma and lack of gender affirmation. And so there's this widespread point of view out there that says these horrible psychological problems that people who identify as transgender have, it's because people don't affirm them enough. And if people would just affirm them enough, and if they had the right, medical attention and psychological care, then they would be better. And one of the items that the gender clinics will recommend to people eventually is some kind of a physical transition, even beyond hormones and puberty blockers, but even to so-called gender reassignment surgeries or gender affirmation surgeries. That's what they call it. Mm-hmm. And so this study is looking at that and, proceeding from the premise that people who are transgender have all these a lot of people have transgender people have these psychological problems, and how can they be resolved? And so that's what this is looking at. And so they're trying to evaluate mental health outcomes in transgender individuals with gender dysphoria who've undergone this surgery. And it's a really fascinating thing, because the bottom line is, I'm going to read you from the conclusion and then we could talk about the rest of it. But the conclusion is this: gender affirming surgery, while beneficial in affirming gender identity, is associated with increased risk of mental health issues, underscoring the need for ongoing gender-sensitive mental health support for transgender individuals post-surgery. Bottom line here, the folks who went through the surgery and that they studied, it says that it's associated with a risk of mental health issues. And when you look into the study at the mental health issues, it's really serious stuff.
Denny, a question someone might be asking who hasn't closely followed these kinds of studies is this a unique finding? Is this a new finding? Should we be surprised by this finding?
No, it's not new. There have been a ton of other studies. I do think it's important to understand what the study is saying. Let me give you some of the specific outcomes, and then tell you about some other studies that have gone in this direction. So this is what they found. Okay, it's really fascinating. So from 107,583 patients, they studied, and they found that the people who went through the surgeries were at significantly higher risk for depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and substance use disorders than those without surgery. So if you were a male and you went through the surgery, you had a higher prevalence of depression, like 24, like more than 2 times as likely to have depression. And then anxiety is more than 4 times as likely to have anxiety as if you didn't have the surgery. Females who they had similar trends. They had elevated depression, almost twice as much, not quite twice as much, but elevated. Anxiety was, you're more likely to have anxiety after the surgery for females. And then there were those who were going through feminizing procedures were at a risk for depression and substance use disorders that was also higher. So it was really these bad outcomes, okay, on the other side of the surgery.
Let me put this on the bottom shelf for our listeners here. Transgenderism, the transgender lie, was sold to the public, was sold to the world on the fact that if we provide affirmation, if we affirm these individuals in their chosen gender identity, that will help their mental health. That will improve their mental health. And if we don't do it, we are harming individuals. We're going to, be causing mental distress if we don't use their pronouns, if we don't, allow them to follow through on these surgeries and their identities. The exact opposite is true. That's what this study affirms. Not only the exact opposite is true, but if you do the affirmation, you get worse outcomes than if you didn't do anything at all.
Yeah, and that's the real problem here is that what the study shows is we have to be careful about what it shows. It's not saying that the surgeries caused these outcomes, right? So they didn't study, they didn't have like a control group of people who wanted surgery, didn't get it, versus people who wanted surgery and did get it. So it was a retrospective study. They didn't do that. So you can't point to this and say, oh, this proves that the surgery did this. What this is showing, and this is where your question about previous studies comes in, what this is showing is that these surgeries aren't fixing these problems. In other words, these people are having serious psychological problems going into the surgeries, and coming out of the surgery, it's not really fixing anything. You will see some of the people say that they were satisfied with the surgery for at least a little while in terms of the way they looked. But all these other, what the psychologists called comorbidities, these other issues of anxiety and depression and the rest, that doesn't go away. And in fact, the prevalence of suicide goes up for people on the other side of these surgeries. I have a book here that I would recommend to readers who, if you really want to get a handle on the transgender phenomenon, I recommend Ryan Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally. And he has a great chapter in here that deals with people who go through these interventions and the studies that have been done on these folks. And there was one really comprehensive study that was done back in 2011 in Sweden. And it says that the rate of psychiatric hospitalization for post-operative transsexuals was about 3 times the rate for control groups. 3 times the rate. Now, again, it's the same kind of study. It doesn't prove that the surgeries caused this, but it's saying that they have severe psychological problems and they're not being fixed by this. It says suicide attempts were nearly 5 times more frequent, and the likelihood of death by suicide was 19 times higher. So in other words, this is a study from a lot longer. This is 14 years ago versus this one that just came out here in 2025, but it's basically showing the same thing. These surgeries aren't fixing these people's distress that they're feeling because of this perceived incongruence between what they feel themselves to be in their mind and what their body is revealing through its organization for reproduction. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line here is that we've got a medical establishment that has been promoting destructive surgeries that don't help people, and in many cases make things worse.
Denny, I know you've talked about this. You've taught on this. What are some of these procedures that we're talking about with regard to transgender, so-called transition?
Yeah, if it's a young girl, so we've talked about this before, but there's been about a 4,000% increase in young adolescent young women who are identifying as transgender or non-binary, and so they put them on. If they go to a typical gender clinic, they'll put them through so-called gender affirming care, which is suppressing their puberty if they're young enough, putting them on opposite sex hormones, so a social transition. And then finally, if they can get their parents to agree to it, even as minors, they'll start doing surgeries. And you can see stories of young women who, as minors, had so-called top surgery. They basically had double mastectomies. They had healthy breasts removed. And so what's going on there? Well, you're taking a healthy organ and you're destroying it. And you're doing it in the name of care, in the name of, doing what is supposedly good for these people. So that's happened to a lot of young women. And some of them, even if they're not minors, just as soon as they achieve the age of consent, they're doing this. For men, the surgeries are really macabre, because to transform, the male anatomy to look like the female anatomy is profound. You end up, I'm just going to describe this because I've read about these medical procedures before, but you end up having to dissect the male organ, turning it inside out and creating a cavity. And if there's not enough skin to create the false female organ, they take a part of the intestine and sew that in. And after they've created this cavity to create this false female organ, it has to be maintained. In other words, there has to be dilators put into it, because otherwise it heals up, because your body treats it as a wound. And the reason for that is because it is a wound. It doesn't become the female organ. It's just a wound on your body that you have to keep open and keep from closing up. So this is the key thing here, and that these studies don't even talk about. It's interesting when you read these scientific studies, they come out, they're a mix of science and evidence and metaphysical claims. And the metaphysical claims, of course, they don't ever really have any grounding for, but you can't turn someone into the opposite sex. You can't ever make a man fertile as a female so that he would have a uterus and large gametes and be able to reproduce as a female. All you can do is cosmetic things to make him look like a female. And then it's even imperfect, and it creates other, physical problems. A lot of the people who go through these surgeries, there's been, reports of deep vein thrombosis and of all these other kinds of problems that some of the people become incontinent, which is not surprising. Surgery's complicated. And so they're destructive surgeries and they're harming people. And this study, what's ironic about this study is these are, they're finding a correlation between bad mental health outcomes and people who go through these surgeries. And then their conclusion is that gender affirming surgery, while beneficial in affirming gender identity, it's associated with all these other mental health issues. But that's the metaphysical claim. Why is it beneficial to affirm a false gender identity? I mean, that's their conclusion, right? It's beneficial because a person who's a man feels himself to be a woman, and here's a surgery that affirms that he's a woman. And they're saying that's beneficial. Why is that beneficial? You're making a metaphysical claim there that such a thing is good. Whereas, we would argue, and, just about every period of human history would argue, that if your body is organized for reproducing as a man, you ought to think of yourself as a man. And there's something deeply wrong if you're thinking of yourself as a woman. But these researchers are concluding, well, it's beneficial in affirming gender identity. I don't think that's beneficial. I think it's a part of the problem. In other words, it's the mind that's broken and that needs to be repaired, not the body. They're taking these healthy bodies and they're breaking the bodies to fit the broken mind instead of taking the broken mind and fitting it to the healthy body.
I think that's just it, where we're seeing this, turning tide in culture. This study's coming out, a few years back, the Tavistock Clinic stops doing these affirmation surgeries, at least on minors. I mean, just recently, Gavin Newsom made news saying that he was, he acknowledged that it's deeply unfair for biological males to compete with, biological females on the track field. And, these things are happening. But here's the deal. Christians don't need the Oxford Journal to tell us that this stuff is ridiculous, that this does not work, that this is going to be harmful for people and not helpful and beneficial. We don't need the Tavistock Clinic. We don't need Gavin Newsom. I mean, I think that's a political, cynical ploy on his part anyway, like Obama did in 2008 with gay marriage. No, the Bible tells us, and common sense and nature clearly reveal that a biological male, it is good and right for him to identify as a man. And being a man is not a cultural construct. It's related to and flows out of your biological sex, and vice versa with females. So Christians, we can chase these studies. We can see how they do. I think when common sense and natural law prevail, things are going to align with the Bible. But we don't need the Oxford Journal to continue to tell us, and that's just evidence for what we've been doing since 2017 and before, standing against the tide, and we're being vindicated. But again, we don't have to be vindicated. The Bible tells us everything that we need.
Yeah, our authority here is not the scientific studies, although, yeah, we're happy to show them when they're confirming what we already know to be true. Yeah. But our authority is not in these studies. Our authority is in God's revelation. He's revealed in nature and in Scripture what it means to be a male and a female. And you can read in Genesis chapter 1, where it says at the very beginning, God made them male and female. In his own image, he made them male and female. So it's a part of our image bearing that we come in these two distinct genres. And it's a part of the goodness of God's creation, which we want to encourage people to affirm and to embrace, and not to destroy through these fake transgender interventions, which actually hurt people.
Well, thank you, brothers, for your comments this conversation. Until next time, everybody, you can find more about the ministry of CBMW at cbmw.org.